Welcome to yet another webinar of the Prague Center for Middle East Relations. Today's topic is the present and the future of the autonomous administration of northern East Syria amid growing instability and challenges. With us today, we have, well, in total 3 distinguished guests, but so far we have 2 online present with us. And that's Dr. Özlem Kayhan Pusane from Icf University and Aviva Stein. And the 3rd speaker will be Qatar Shaikhmus. Hopefully he will join with us soon. So this session today will discuss recent political and security developments in the Kurdish-led autonomous administration in northeast Syria. Speakers will look into political and security situation, the state of governance, and numerous challenges the area faces. And I would say these challenges seem to be piling up lately. Oh, hello, Qatar. So we have all 3 speakers. Perfect. I was just going with the introductions. So as I said, I think those challenges, may be political, economic, or security, are kind of piling up in the northeast of Syria, in my view at least. We are going to look into different contexts, the administration, and different constraints they're facing in Arab majority and core Kurdish majority areas, as well as facing internal and external security and political challenges. We will also touch upon the role of both internal and external players in the northeast of Syria, with special focus. That's why we have with us Dr. Özlem, with special focus on Turkish policies, concerns, and ideas about these developments and Turkish role in general in the wider region of northern Syria. Of course, all will be also connected to the Turkish counterinsurgency efforts against the Kurdistan Workers' Party. So first of all, let me introduce our guests. I will start with Aviva because she will be speaking first. She's an international development consultant. She's focusing on good governance and peace building. She got her Master of Arts in Conflict Studies and Human Rights at Utrecht University, and focused her professional trajectory on examining the intersection of conflict prevention and resolution, non-state actors, international humanitarian laws and norms, and gender studies, in particular focusing on the Middle East and North Africa. She worked with a wide range of international actors, including providing support for the UN OPCW mission to Syria, designing and implementing NGO projects, developing reports for NGOs, conducting scoping missions and program evaluations. She also gained experience related to the Syrian crisis and Kurdish questions, having visited various parts of North Syria numerous times and working directly with multiple civil society organizations and various local actors on the ground, including the autonomous administration itself and the Kurdish Democratic Union Party, Syriac Union Party, and the Kurdish National Congress. She designed, implemented development and capacity building programs on diplomacy, empowerment, international norms and protocols, good governance practices, and countering violent extremism for diverse portfolio of clients, including NGOs, diplomatic missions, universities, and governance. So as you can see, Aviva has very extensive experience on the ground. She will be, I think, also with Qatar, the voice of practitioners in this debate. The second speaker is Qatar Shaikhmus. He is Executive Director of SHAR for Development, which focuses on enhancing civil society governance and economic development in northeast Syria in general and Kurdish regions in particular. He's coming from Qamishli, Syria. He has a long family and personal history of activism with Kurdish cultural and political movements. In March 2011, Qatar participated in Syrian uprising through mobilization at Aleppo University and nationwide. He was forced to stay outside of Syria. After photos were released showing him with foreign officials, he attended 2012 Rising Stars program in Bosnia and 2013 Rising Stars program in Prague, Czech Republic. He was also selected to participate to the US Department of State IVLP program for youth political leadership in 2014. And I believe Qatar is at the moment based in Kamishli, right? So he will have, I presume, some hot up-to-date from the ground assessment for us. And last but not least, we have Dr. Özlem Kayhan Kusane. She's currently an associate professor of international relations at Icf University in Istanbul, Turkey. She graduated from the Middle East Technical University in Ankara with a Bachelor of Science in International Relations. She received her MA in Political Science from the University of Notre Dame in the US in 2004, where she also received her PhD in Political Science in 2009. Özlem's broader research and teaching interests lie in the areas of security studies, civil-military relations, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and Turkish security and foreign policy. So as you can see, we have three distinguished guests with us. As we talked about the order of your proceedings, Aviva could go first, then Kadar will speak, and Özlem will wrap up with providing us with a Turkish perspective. I would like to ask you to confine your opening statements for, let's say, 10 to 15 minutes, so we have enough time for the discussion, for the questions from the audience. Just instructions for the audience. Feel free to just drop me your questions in chat, or just simply then raise your hand functions after the opening statements, and you can comment or ask a question directly if you wish. So without further ado, Aviva, could you please paint the situation for us?
Great, thanks so much. I have to say, my bio sounds way more impressive when someone else reads it out loud. So thank you for having me. As I'll be going first, I would like to sort of set the stage with a basic overview of the Autonomous Administration in Northeast Syria, how the structures work, what they're based on. So the governing structure, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is called Democratic Confederalism, and it is based on four main pillars: gender equality, multiculturalism, sustainability, and self-defense. And self-defense does not only mean defense in a military sense, but also a resurgence of culture, of indigenous languages, of community, and protecting the culture itself as a means of existence and survival. So it goes beyond the traditional military sense. The structures are built in a way that it operates from the ground up as grassroots democratic practices. At the base level, you have the commune structures that can include villages or households inside a city. And then these communes meet at the neighborhood or village council level, where they have boards that make up neighborhood councils, followed by the next level up, which is the district council level, that can include a whole city and the surrounding lands. And you have boards of the neighborhood councils, which represent at this district level. And then the board of this district level is known as Tebdem. And this is where the political parties start to become active. Then at the district council level, there are also committees that operate. There is a separate women's council at every level. And the women's councils also have committees that work together alongside the general committees, and these topics topics include women's rights, the Defense Committee, an Economics Committee, a Political Committee, Civil Society Committee, a Free Society Committee, Justice Committee, and an Ideology Committee. And then above this, you have the self-administration, the democratic self-administration, which includes legislative council and executive council and municipal administrations. So these structures are aimed at operating from the ground up to make sure that needs are met at the most basic level possible. So issues are raised when the lower level cannot make a decision or solve something itself, and they raise it to the next level. For example, coordinating trash collection or mail delivery would be at a higher level because it's on a wider scale versus a dispute between neighbors that can be solved in those local levels. There are usually quotas, generally 40%, for ensuring the representation of different ethnic groups and women in representative committees. When it's not the standard 40%, these quotas are generally based on the population distribution in each area or level, and this aims to have fair representation of all voices. Every government council or body is headed by 2 democratically elected co-chairs, almost always one man and one woman, and almost always from different ethnic backgrounds. Additional structures alongside the administration also include Congress Star, which means the Star Congress, and this is the Congress of the Women's Movement, first established in 2004. They also operate on the basis of confederalism. They have organizations, committees, and unions all participating, and they work together operating organizations such as Malajin, women's houses, which are safe houses for women fleeing domestic violence or in need of support, economic empowerment, or skill building. So these are some of the organizations and ways in which the system operates. Jinwar is another women's organization. It's a village specifically designed by and for women that combines the basic elements, democracy, ecology, and women's liberation. There's a focus on sustainability in this village in particular, and that includes from the traditional mud brick construction that's used to build the homes there, and also the plots of land that everyone harvests communally for both internal consumption and markets. That makes the village mostly self-sustaining. Now, this can sound kind of utopia-esque, but of course we know there are challenges, and there are many challenges. This is an active conflict zone, but we also have to remember that the revolution and the movement is in its current activity and its current iteration only a decade old. Due to the widespread use of social media and the intensive global scrutiny that this movement in particular has been under, there are many who feel like the movement should be further along in creating this dynamic utopia. But the fact is, ANS, the Autonomous Administration, has come further than many other movements in the same amount of time. And to expect a level of perfection is both impractical and it's unfair. They are dealing with an active conflict, but they're also dealing with decades of oppression, the use of education and economic disempowerment as tools aimed to divide and conquer by the Assad regime and the previous Assad regime. There are still high levels of internalized nationalism, misogyny, ethnocentrism, racism, and intolerance, and all of these issues and divisions will take a long time to overcome. And you can look at the United States. We've been going for 200 years and we still can't overcome these divisions. So it's not a simple problem to overcome, especially when you're surrounded by conflict and groups on all sides who would see you fail. One of the major challenges is, of course, in the Arab majority areas. There are different structures and styles of governments, and there has been pushback against the implementation of Kurdish systems. Imposing democratic confederalism in Kurdish systems onto the majority Arab communities would defeat the purpose of the system in the first place. So there have been many necessary compromises and concessions on both sides in order to move forward towards inclusive and democratic practices. For example, in some cases, proportional representation hasn't been implemented fully, or it has, but in practice, the roles reserved for Arabs, both men and women, are lower level or administrative rather than leadership roles. This has been the case, for example, in Manbij, where the Manbij Military Council consists of 2 Kurdish men and 2 Arab men, with 2 Kurdish women advisors, despite Manbij being a majority Arab city. Additionally, there can be tensions between communities that embrace different cultural norms. You have many more traditional Arab groups, more progressive Kurdish groups. And this can be seen especially in instances where, for example, Kurdish women might be promoted over Arab men, or when Arab women are employed or promoted. And many Arab men might see this as discriminatory or a unfair fast tracking of gender equality. While on the other hand, many Arab women feel that this is a crucial step in enacting laws that are aimed to protect and encourage women's freedoms and enable them to actually take part in all of society. So it's a very delicate balancing act. And this act of balancing, traditions and inclusivity, it's not only between Arabs and Kurds, which I think is an important point to make. There's a really diverse array of multi-ethnic communities, also challenges that require nuanced attention, support, and compromise in creating a system that truly respects all rights and includes all voices. There are Syriacs, Assyrians, Turkmen, Armenians, Chaldeans, Yazidis, and many other groups that all rightly deserve a seat at the table, but that all come with their own baggage to unpack and their own challenges and internal and external dynamics to overcome. So these are some of the internal dynamics and challenges in multiculturalism and inclusion, but you also have the external pressures of choosing the right allies or political negotiation counterparts. We have an ongoing struggle between Russian and US influence in which the autonomous administration is really caught between a rock and a hard place. Do you choose the ally who has promised to help and then pulled out repeatedly? Or do you choose using ally in quotes here for both of them, or do you choose the ally who openly says that when we don't need you anymore, leave? So it's a very difficult choice to make, and they're navigating these waters as these global heroes, so to speak. They were put on a pedestal of being this amazing force against the Islamic State and the world from this terrorist threat. And now they've sort of been left in the dust again, now that the threat is more or less vanquished. So they're really sitting in a difficult position and facing a lot of pressures, both internally and externally. Additional challenges include the ongoing economic issues, and Qatar, I know you'll be touching on this later, so I won't go too deeply into it, but smuggling has become a huge business, not just of food, but also and oil, but also of drugs. Much of the drug trade passes through the Northeast. Brain drain is also a serious problem. The protracted conflict and the economic crisis is leading to a new wave of people leaving the region in hopes of providing more for their families abroad, but it's also preventing people who would like to return from being able to, and to effectively rebuild if they do. Another challenge is the lack of educated leadership. Education was one of the tools that the Assad regime used to oppress all of the communities in the Northeast. So you have an entire generation that couldn't speak their own language at school, couldn't go to school past a certain age. And so many of the original leaders in the movement, they've stepped aside in order to allow the system to grow and prevent it from turning into yet another form of dictatorship. But this has resulted in kind of a vacuum of leadership because education was used as this tool for so long to keep minority communities from becoming active citizens. So now you have many younger leaders who are learning on the job rather than bringing existing experience and expertise to their roles. Of course, this is not a blanket statement. There are very many wonderful, experienced leaders still in the region, but as you have this turnover, this becomes a problem that we can see as a practitioner in the West. A lot of times when we have delegations come and visit, when we try to support external parties who come in to take part in negotiations. And so there's a lot of communications and diplomacy and negotiation training that needs to happen in order to make sure they can be as effective as possible. Additionally, another challenge is the water crisis that is now ongoing. Turkey has continued its efforts to destabilize the region, and in particular, recently, this has taken the form of destruction of essential dams and water infrastructure. And this is creating a huge health crisis and a surge in waterborne diseases on top of the COVID health crisis. So this is also a major challenge that's compounding a lot of difficulties that the administration is facing. And finally, vigilante groups. An unintended consequence of having such a decentralized system is that you get these vigilante groups, these extremist groups popping up to take what they consider justice into their own hands. And this has resulted in extrajudicial kidnappings and killings of various figures, including Syriac journalists, including Kurdish politicians. You have these groups on all sides. This is sometimes done by or blamed on ISIS affiliated groups or cells, but it's also being committed by extremist groups that have emerged from internal communities. Now, that's not to say that there's nothing positive. There are many positive things, and there have been many positive improvements. Recently, conscription was suspended. Now that the fight against ISIS is more of an ongoing counterterrorism operation than an active conflict. There was a series of protests against mandatory conscription in Manbij. This ended in an unfortunate incident that ended up with security forces firing on protesters. And as a result of this, the administration decided to suspend conscription first in Manbij and then a few days later throughout the region. So this has now been suspended as a whole. Additionally, efforts are ongoing since, I believe, October of last year to demobilize underage fighters. There have been offices set up across the region specifically for this purpose. And so far, around 50 to 60 underage fighters have been demobilized and returned to non-conflict zones. And these efforts are continuing, although they do face the challenge of unofficial groups still recruiting minors. They are pushing back against this, and there are active efforts to demobilize child soldiers and to adhere to the declarations of commitment that they signed both with Geneva Call in 2014, I believe 2014, and the UN in 2019. So all in all, the administration and the region continue to move in a positive direction of inclusive democracy, despite setbacks, despite environmental crises, and despite the continuously diminishing global attention and support. We should remember, as we analyze this movement, that it is a movement still in its infancy, and that it was born out of necessity and opportunity, rather than having decades and decades to grow organically. It was really sped up quite quickly. And while it has come a long way already, there is still a long way to go. So to hold up such a system against fully established global powers or movements in post-conflict or completely different contexts does a disservice to our understanding of the situation, as well as to the region and the administration itself. So thank you very much. With that, I will hand it back to you.
Thank you, Aviva. Already questions are popping out of this. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Kadar, the floor is yours if you are ready. Thank you.
Aviva, you summarized perfectly some of the issues I would already talk about. Still, thank you. Is this screen being shared or not? So this is part of the thing that Aviva was actually talking about. Here is Manbij. I'll just briefly go through each region of the challenges, the security mostly challenges that are facing the region. In Manbij recently, there were some protests against the forced conscription, which Aviva just mentioned. The root causes for that was an attack organized by actually Syrian government army checkpoint against the protesters who were protesting the forced conscription of the local administration in northeast Syria. 2 of the people were killed as a result. There was massive demonstrations, call-outs, blockades. At the same time, pro-Turkey groups from the Euphrates Shield tried to attack, and the incident happened in May. So as of 30th of May this year, some of these on and off demonstrations led to intensive dialogue between tribal leaders, community leaders, and the local council of Manbij, of the local administration. One of the issues that Aviva touched upon, which was to which degree some of the communities are able and grasping gender equality. Some of the demands, literal demands of people from tribal leadership was asking for polygamy for men, a rule that is actually banned in both northeast Syria and the surrounding countries, with the exception that the current Syrian law still approves it in regime areas, and also the Syrian opposition in the northwest of Syria, which is a bit ironic given that everything in terms of legality is being adopted to a degree is in compliance with the Turkish law, for instance, in the Euphrates Shield areas, except for this law. So some of the agreements that was done, the points was release of all detainees, and then establishment of commission, truth-finding commission by the local community and the local council to see what happened exactly, and then work on a kind of transitional justice framework to address the issue. And the third was suspend the conscription campaign in Manbij first, and then all across the region, because other regions have actually called for the same thing to be suspended. We're talking about Manbij, which was, as Aviva said, the Americans left in no time, and the Russians, one of the first areas or bases to be retaken or controlled by the Russians was actually the US troop base in Manbij, and then filling out the outposts in the borderline between the Sajur line and between pro-Turkey Euphrates Shield groups and SDF, and there are some checkpoints for the Syrian army. Ironically enough, I'm here on the ground, and the supply that is happening for the Syrian government army is actually done by SDF, because they cannot support the community and their soldiers, let alone taking over about the whole of Euphrates, the northeast of Euphrates, or any other region across Syria as a military structure and as a sustainability force to provide security, quote unquote. This is just one of the issues that we are facing. I'll move now to, is the map clear? This is Deir Zor, which is one of the hotbed of conscription and attacks zone for ISIS, especially in the Euphrates, in the eastern suburbs. Currently, mostly it's the river of the Euphrates that is actually separating government-controlled areas and regime and the SDF controlled areas. But mostly, some of the last pockets of ISIS was actually in the south, in the very south east of this map, north of Bukamal, in areas like Hejin and others. The flow of ISIS, since its foundation and since its beginning in 2013, was happening through these areas, mostly never controlled by any group, not even in the days of the regime before the 2011, mostly an area of smuggling. The area itself was used as a logistic supply line for a terrorist group at the time, into the Islamic State of Iraq at the days of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. Still, this kind of infiltrations do happen, with the source coming from Anbar region in Western Iraq. However, ironically, there is a decrease in the attacks in this region because of tribal agreements. Some of the efforts included dealing and using some of the communities themselves to be the guarantor of the agreements between the local tribal community in Deir ez-Zor and the local administration. There were guarantors of this agreement, and the guarantors were tribes from other regions, including but not limited to some Kurdish figures and tribal leaders, which is not being mentioned. It's ironic, but it's part of kind of community mobilization itself, not a push of strength of what I would say the military presence of any Kurdish force through a tribal structure. We don't have that here. It's more of social agreements and also trade as well. The other issue was Raqqa. Since 10th of May, there have been attacks on outposts of SDF. They did happen in Deir ez-Zor through ISIS cells. But what is happening in Raqqa, there is no presence of ISIS. Most of the city is secure. It's one of the safest cities in northeast Syria, and people are moving thoroughly, even though there is a huge amount of destruction since the days of the coalition attacks, the Russian bombardment, and other days of ISIS control of the region, and also former Islamic groups that were laid the foundation for ISIS presence in 2013 and beyond. Then the takeover of SDF right now. The city itself is safe. The surrounding area is safe up until recently in May. On the 13th of May, 14th of May, and 15th of May, and the 10th of May, there have been attacks on Icf Outposts through IEDs. Mostly what you would call it from a security perspective, the same technology that was being used in Iraq against the US Army. That kind of technology is not coming from ISIS. That kind of technology is coming from pro-Iranian militias across the river who want to destabilize the region as well. There have been some threats by pro-Iranian militias. They have been trying attempts to recruit and activate militias. It happened also in Qamishli as well. Here, sorry. Just trying to. During the takeover of Al-Tai neighborhood, which is a heavily Arab majority district within the city of Qamishli, during these attacks and clashes by national defense forces in Qamishli city, the attacks were not supported by the government of Syrian army. So they were separate from the framework that is actually more aligned with the Russian troops that are based in the Qamishli airport itself. NDF itself did not get any support from the Syrian government army, and it was ironic because you see the clashes are happening. SDF is responding to the source of fire in NDF controlled areas, but the army, which normally was supporting that group, step aside. The Russian military presence in Qamishli airport also said they tried to negotiate first with them, but they said they didn't support them as well. That led to the cleaning or the takeover of SDF of full control of the city of Qamishli itself, with an exception to the small areas controlled by the Syrian army, and the airport, which is actually jointly operated by the Russian forces and government of Syrian forces, in addition to the small block in the city of Hasake as well. There have been some arrests, some vigilante groups, as Aviva mentioned, but that was still within the framework of solvable issues. There have been attempts also gunfire around Al-Tamr as well. That is on one hand. Aside from this, there has been attempts to respond to the drop in the water levels of the Euphrates that were actually was a result from the filling of Ataturk Dam in the Turkish side. The drop was by more than 5 meters, which means if it's a problem in Syria, then it will be a catastrophe in Iraq. Ironically, nobody is actually even talking about from the Iraqi side as well. That led to a huge drop. And the kind of the drop that we are talking about here is, it only adds up to the problem that we were having of water resources, especially and specifically the grain, wheat and barley. As an organization, as we are working with and for the communities here in both Deir ez-Zor and Hasaki governorates, you're talking about a drop of 80% of the grain. If this area is affected, then all of Syria is almost dead. If bread prices rise, everything will be rising. And that also was reflected through, there was a motion by the local administration to raise the prices of the fuel by 300%. Demonstrations took place in no time. People from the community protesting that, and it led eventually to ending that decree, the famous decree of 119. I will just give some numbers about the wheat and why it will be a problem, and how it's affecting the trajectory of the community and how it could be affected. In 2018, there have been massive fires against wheat lands in northeast Syria. Massive fire affected the crop and led to huge losses to the economy that is 50% depending on agriculture as a source of income and also as livestock. In 2019, 2020, Corona also affected with inflation in the prices of the Syrian pound. I returned last year to my hometown after 8 years. When I first entered, $100 was equating 100,000 Syrian pound. In less than a year, the number was 3 times. Each $1 became 3,000. So this is 300% in addition to Corona restrictions and lockdowns, in addition to the already fractured economy caused by the fires in the wheat, in addition to the drop of the rain, in addition to the instability and people losing their savings after 10 years of war in this region. Aside from that, I will give just one number when it comes to wheat. In 2020, the problem only got worse. The drop of the Euphrates River affected areas mainly in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. In addition to that, the drop of that water levels affected the northeast Hasaki governorate, as well as the rainfall average in 2020 was 190 millimeters. It used to be 375 the year before. This have put almost 80% of the crops in, and is now being sold as fodder, which means that the amount of money the amount of production of each crop for each acre was 150 to 250 kilogram per acre for the rain-fed. For the irrigated was 400 to 550. But right now it's massively dropped, and it is 200 instead of 400 for the irrigated systems. This means that in 3 months from now, if the bread prices are rising, and they will be rising, it will be around 200 to 300%, which is an essential service. If that is rising, then everything, given that the source of wheat and grain is coming from this to northeast Syria, to northwest Syria, and to southeast Syria, to the government-controlled areas and the opposition-controlled areas, if it's 300% here, it will be 600% in the government of Syria, and around 500% in Syrian opposition regions. This is an economic collapse that is at a no site. It's like it will happen in no time. In addition to this, the prices of fuel, they will, yes, the decree was stopped, but it will be returning, given that there was an attempt by Delta government, Delta Crescent, for the deal which didn't happen. Thomas, you remember I was discussing last time that this will not happen, and it didn't. So what's happening now? What's happening now is that there is a counter offer by the Russian new leadership in Hmeimim to do exactly this with an American, with a Russian company. We still don't know, but this could happen. And why it could happen? Because it's needed. Why? Because if the fuel here is stopping at, say, 150 Syrian pounds per 1 liter for diesel, it reaches Damascus at 600, and it's at northwest Syria at around 400. You make the calculation, it's 300% with this. You are talking about transportation. You're talking about heating. You're talking about basic source for energy, even for electricity, which is not stable, given that the networks all over Syria are affected. One of the main discussion points was what happened when the decree of 119 was issued. The core group, the core supporters of the local administration were the first to demonstrate against the law. Why? Because it reaches, or it's a replica of what's going on. If you cannot provide for basic services, you cannot secure governance. And unfortunately, with all the aid that is going into Syria, less than 5% is getting and being given to this region. The blame here is for the actors. Who could be responding to this issue? One word: Germany. Why? Syria has become an internal issue for German politics. If you're talking about returning of refugees, and it happened, Denmark is openly debating. The center left in Denmark is acting as center right, and even worse than center right when it comes to refugees. So, and this is the parliament is discussing this openly. It could become, and in no time, people would be fleeing northeast Syria, northwest of Syria, and even government-controlled areas as a result of the economic collapse. In 3 months or 4 months or 6 months from now, these issues will be touched. The intervention of the local organizations is limited, given the limited of resources, and also the lack of funding for this region, given the fight between OCHA Gaziantep and OCHA Damascus, which both don't serve the region. I'll highlight another issue in terms of, aside from the inflation, the boogeyman. It seems the corona vaccine that many people in Europe, Biden administration is talking about the vaccine diplomacy. We've seen nothing of that yet. And I don't think that we will see. COVAX did support with AstraZeneca in some of the regions, but not much to the northeast of Syria, not much to northwest as well, and not much to the government of Syria. The whole dose from COVAX was 200,000. We're talking about around 12 to 13 million Syrians who are still living inside Syria, with shifting population between people in Turkey returning, people in Lebanon returning, people in Iraq returning. This is one of the main
Qatar, I'm really sorry. Can you wrap it up?
Sure.
Can you wrap it up very quickly? Thank you very much.
What I'm trying to finalize here, and it could be for another time, is that the ethnic fabric, the religious fabric of any community will definitely face governance issues. And this fabric can be only preserved if you push for more reform and not in a drastic way. What is happening is good, but if there is no real guarantee and real support for change, nothing will happen. Aside from this, the real efforts for any settlement, in my personal opinion, and we can debate for long. It's not going to happen and come from Geneva, because the last meeting between the Russians and the Americans did not touch upon that publicly. And also, it's still the Iran JCPOA is still overshadowing the discussions. What I believe is the commitments that could happen kind of will be reviving the French initiative that was done with the Russians and with consent from the Americans. Basically, what I mean, it's a kind of a deal that will happen on the regional level and inside Syria, but not outside that. Also, with the openness of Emirates and Saudi Arabia back to the regime, they can also be playing a role to focus on stabilization of northeast Syria, as well as that they are actually funding many of the programs that are implemented by international actors in this region as well.
Thank you very much, Qatar. Thank you very much for your assessment. I especially appreciate that you touch upon those socio-economic issues because, well, if bread is expensive, if fuel is expensive, it's hard to think about other things. It's hard to think about democratization. It's hard to think about inclusiveness of institutions if you cannot provide basic services. Okay, last but not least, Özlem, could you please provide us Turkish perspective, Turkish visions? We haven't talked about Turkey that much apart from the water crisis, but I'm sure you're going to mention it has two sides of the coin because the administration also withholds electricity from certain areas. It's a kind of tit for tat situation in a way. But anyway, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me. And thank you very much for these informative talks. So I will be talking a little bit about the recent Turkish policy towards northern Syria and how that can be placed within the broader counterterrorism and counterinsurgency policies of the Turkish government. And for that, I think in order to have a good understanding of the current policies, we need to go back for about a decade or so, because around 2009, the Justice and Development Party in Turkey initiated a number of efforts to resolve Turkey's Kurdish question through peaceful means, through political means. And that actually lasted until 2015. And these efforts had, a number of different names over time. First, in 2009, it was the Kurdish opening. And then, there was an Oslo process. Apparently, there was an outside mediator. And then in late 2012, a new process called the settlement or the resolution process started. And that lasted until 2015, in which there were talks between the jailed PKK leader, Abdullah Öcalan, and the representatives of the, Peace and People's Democratic Party. And this was actually part of a bigger picture. This was actually part of a broader policy of the Justice and Development Party, because they actually wanted to improve they wanted to resolve Turkey's Kurdish question through peaceful means. And then they also wanted to improve Turkey's relations with the regional Kurds and basically improve or increase Turkey's sphere of influence in the region. So that was part of a bigger effort and, bigger policy. And, within that framework, there were also these efforts to improve Turkey's relations with the Iraqi Kurds and, specifically the Iraqi Kurdistan regional government, which actually, worked. And within that time period, also the co-chairperson of the PYD, Salih Muslim at the time, came to Turkey, so had talks with these, top Turkish officials at the time. And, Salih Muslim is actually an interesting figure from a Turkish perspective because he speaks fluent Turkish, and apparently he did his undergrad in Istanbul Technical University. So in those years, the news articles about him, were very positive. And, that's why, I wanted to mention that this whole thing was a broad policy. Unfortunately, it failed. It failed by 2015, and the policy that we observe today is what emerged from post 2015 in the post 2015 period. And of course, I will not go into the reasons why the peace process failed. Of course, there were several different reasons why. But I should mention that there were two important developments at the time, so around 2015. One internal and one external. And internally, during that time period, there was this emerging conservative nationalist, an unofficial conservative nationalist coalition between the Justice and Development Party and the Nationalist Movement Party. And within that framework, there were these increasing nationalist sentiments in the country. And, the perception about, the Kurdish question, the regional Kurds, began to be a little bit negative. And from an external point of view, around that time period, the fight against the ISIS, got accelerated. And, in Syria, PYD-YPG emerged as the main actor, as the main local actor, and a rising actor in the fight against the ISIS. And, combined with this domestic nationalist sentiments, the Turkish policymakers begin to perceive the Kurdish gains in the region from a negative perspective. And, again, the peace process had its problems too. And eventually in 2015, the peace process failed. And right after that, there was a new, conflict, a new armed conflict started between the Turkish security forces and the PKK. First, in Southeast Anatolia, it was mostly in the form of urban warfare. And as that started and as that proceeded, the Justice and Development Party and the Turkish security establishment, I should say, developed a new or began to pursue a new counterterrorism and counterinsurgency policy towards the PKK, which included the regional dimensions, the regional connections of the PKK. And it was actually in this time period that Turkey also showed a pretty negative and harsh reaction to the Iraqi Kurdish independence referendum in 2017. Turkey's relations with the Iraqi Kurds, are not that bad today, but still, within the context of these, rising national sentiments and, everything that has happened, since 2009, the relationship between Turkey and the Iraqi Kurds also, experienced several ups and downs. But it was the Syrian Kurds and the PYD-YPG that got the hardest hit because because of the PYD-YPG's connections with the PKK. Turkey has a more negative perception of the Syrian Kurds, but not Syrian Kurds in general. Specifically the PYD-YPG. And within this context, so the peace process failed, and the rising importance of the YPG in the fight against the PKK, rising nationalist sentiments in Turkey. As I said, a new counterterrorism perspective began to be pursued in Turkey, and as a result of this, the Turkish security forces carried out 3 major cross-border military operations into northern Syria. So it started in 2016 with the Euphrates Shield, and then in 2018 there was the Olive Branch, and then finally in 2019, there was the Operation Peace Spring. At first, especially in the Euphrates Shield, partly that operation was about, or was part of the fight against the ISIS. It was partly about that, but Turkey's main concern was to prevent the emergence of a Kurdish corridor in northern Syria. Because as I said, that's the major concern for the Turkish policymakers, for the Turkish security establishment, because of the connections to the PKK. So, Turkey perceives it as a major national security threat. And this was also combined with a counterterrorism policy towards northern Iraq, because especially from 2015 onwards, there was this idea that, okay, we can fight against the PKK effectively in Turkey, but now, this is a regional problem. PKK has connections in the region, and especially actually, in northern Iraq, from the 1990s onwards, there was the PKK presence on the Kandil Mountains, within today's borders of the Iraqi Kurdistan regional government. But especially, after the fight against the ISIS, now PKK also has a presence in Sinjar, and that's doubling PKK's presence there, and that's again another major concern for the Turkish government, and that's why from 2015 onwards, there was this idea of deepening and enlarging Turkey's operational area in the fight against the PKK, and to basically struggle against the PKK outside of Turkey's borders. Because again, there is this idea that we need to start there, because if we do not address the PKK presence in northern Iraq, on the Kandil Mountains and in Sinjar, and if we do not address the PKK presence in northern Syria, we cannot deal with this problem. And that's why from 2018 onwards, there have been a number of cross-border military operations into northern Iraq, and that mainly targeted, or that mainly aimed at preventing the PKK's infiltration into Turkey, because these are really very close areas, right? So infiltration or cross-border movements are not that difficult. Okay, so I find this really interesting, because I think the evolution of this whole policy, the evolution of Turkey's policy shows us that some of these things are conjunctural. I especially find Turkey's attitude towards the former PYD co-chairperson Salih Muslim very interesting, because as I said, in 2013, it was really surprising that he visited Turkey, and he was actually, according to the news articles that I read, he was invited to Turkey by the Turkish foreign minister, and he had all these meetings with the top officials. And at that time, PYD still had connections to the PKK, but that was not the context at the time. That was not the discourse at the time, because there was a peace process going on. There was this whole policy of, let's resolve our domestic Kurdish question, and let's also improve our relations with the regional Kurds. So, that was the discourse of the time. But things really changed from 2015 onwards. Of course, these things did not happen overnight. We already knew that the peace process was not going well, and things deteriorated gradually. But from 2015 2015 onwards, I mean, the policies changed and the discourse changed, right? And this is also something that we actually observed with regard to Turkey's relations with the Iraqi Kurds, because in the past, the Iraqi Kurds, or the autonomous area in northern Iraq, even before formal KRG emerged with the with the most recent Iraqi constitution, the presence of an autonomous Iraqi Kurdish region was perceived as a national security threat for Turkey. From the 1990s onwards, it was a major thing. But the government made a decision from around 2008, 2009 onwards, and today, as I said, I mean, there have been ups and downs, but in general, when you look at the bigger picture, Turkey has a pretty positive relationship with the Iraqi Kurds, compared to the PYD-YPG at least. So that actually, shows us that, things can change. Some of these things, some of this discourse, some of these policies are conjunctural, and even something that was perceived as an existential security threat actually changed over time. As I said, I mean, the presence of the Iraqi autonomous, the Iraqi Kurdish autonomous region was a no-no, in the past. So over time, it became okay. So, I mean, I find the conjunctural nature of all of this really interesting. But today's situation in Turkey, the discourse, the context, the domestic context, and how Turkey places itself in the region, in the world, apparently, dictates this kind of a policy. But these days, apparently, I have been reading that the United States is, trying to create a separation between PYD-YPG and the PKK. So, trying to emphasize that these are really different actors, and, the connection is not that kind of a terror connection, and, the United States, I think, will try to convince Turkey that, Turkey should, focus on its relations with the, PYD, or, relations with the autonomous region in, northern Syria, and, make sure that they are, different and separate from the PKK. So some kind, I don't know how to actually express this, but apparently the United States has been trying to create some kind of a, stronger separation between these actors. And, it happened, and it worked in the past regarding the Iraqi Kurds, but, that was different, and that was easier because, what was problematic from the Turkish perspective regarding the Iraqi Kurds was that, again, the Turkish perception in the past was that the Iraqi Kurds were, tolerating the PKK activities. They were tolerating the PKK's, attacks, attacks on Turkey and things like that. So, from an ideological point of view, or from a, from a policy point of view, Iraqi Kurds were not the main problem. So it worked easier that way. But, regarding the PYD-YPG, things are a little bit difficult because, there is a connection between the PKK and the PYD-YPG. I mean, I understand that they are not the same actor, of course, but from a human resource point of view, from an ideological point of view, there are links. And as I said, especially since 2015, these connections have been emphasized pretty strongly in Turkey. So I'm not sure to what extent, the Turkish public, the current policymakers, public, the opposition can overcome that and, try to pursue a new kind of policy. But as I said, I mean, some of these things are conjunctural, so things can change. You know, the context can change, and as the context changes, you know, Turkish policies can change. So I guess we'll see. I guess we'll see. But you know, the current situation does not seem that hopeful. So you know, I can say that the perception is pretty negative in Turkey, and I guess we'll all follow and see what's going to happen. But you know, once again, I would like to mention that when I look at how things evolved between Turkey and the regional Kurds from the 1990s onwards, you know, I see that, you know, change happens. So I guess we'll all observe and, you know, see what's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Özlem. Ladies and gentlemen, now we will start the Q&A session. So if you have a question, just write it into chat. I will read it out for our speakers, so you can just raise hand. But first, I reserve my right or privilege as a moderator to ask one question each of the speakers. So let's start with Özlem. So do you see a scenario where Turkey makes an agreement with the administration in the Northeast? I mean, what are the main points of discontent? What should be resolved? What would make this acceptable for Turkey to, for example, open borders for trade, to buy oil, etc., to sort of at least establish, let's say, pragmatic economic relationship that nobody would at least, let's say, propagate so much in the public, because as you mentioned, it's quite often hard to sell, and it's always a political risk to have somewhat favorable policies towards the Kurdish issue in Turkey at certain times. So that's question number one. Now I have a question for Qatar. You mentioned Iranian influence, which is something kind of interesting, and we hear from it. We hear about it more and more, not only Raqqa, and before that we heard mainly about Deir ez-Zor area. But lately we've been hearing about efforts to, for example, recruit for militias in Hasaka and Qamishli. So it seems that the Iranian efforts are expanding. So to what extent are they successful? I know they have been quite successful in, for example, government-held areas, in expanding their units, in expanding their support base, but to what extent they are successful in the Northeast? And for Aviva, my question is, what's the link between the, not the link, let's say, perhaps we all know, or we can all agree that the PKK veterans, cadres, and commanders have always played a very prominent role, both in the armed structures, both in the political structures. But as Özlem said, there have been efforts to, let's say, transform. I think not even the US dreams about completely cutting those ties in the short term or midterm. But were there any significant changes? Do we see less cadres, as they are usually called, having influence on the administration, on running the show behind the scenes, on controlling economy, controlling oil and gas, etc. So these are, and I will also read one question from the audience. Yerney is asking, well, he's kind of optimistic. Syria after the Ba'ath regime. Well, we will see about that. But he's essentially, if I understand the question correctly, asking what will the post-war Syria, probably given that the regime somewhat will stay, after all, militarily they more or less won the war, what will it bring for Syrian Kurds? I guess what should be expected for Syrian Kurds in the Northeast and in general in the country. So thank you.
So shall I start?
if you are ready.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that is easy. So, I mean, I'm not sure about the, main motivation. I don't know what the main motivation may be. I mean, regarding the Iraqi Kurds, it was economic, but I mean, I believe and I suspect, I remember reading, so I'm not 100% sure, but there's some indirect trade, economic relations, something like that, with the region. I'm not sure, but I remember reading things like that. It may not be direct, but I think there's an indirect thing happening. But anyway, for a relationship to, develop, I mean, the PYD or, YPG or the administration, they have to, take a stance about the PKK. Maybe they should say things like, we are against the PKK's attacks against Turkey, something like that. Turkey would wait for a position like that. I'm not sure whether it's possible or not, but I'm just saying it, so I may sound utopian. I'm saying this because that was kind of the case with the Iraqi Kurds, and that's why from now and then the KRG makes those kinds of statements, saying that, well, okay, Turkey has been carrying out these cross-border military operations, but it's because of the PKK, so it's because of your presence, things like that. So unless there is that kind of a separation, or unless there is that kind of a position, I don't see a relationship emerging. But as I said, I cannot know what the real motivation, or what the main motivation could be for a Turkish government, the current one or a future one, I don't know. But as long as there is that connection going on, I don't see a relationship emerging easy.
Thank you, Özlem. Kadar, could you answer your question regarding the Iranian policies and influence, let's say influence?
I will just add one thing to what Özlem was saying. One of the most safest front lines or border in Syria and Turkey was the border between SDF controlled areas and Turkey. It includes two cases that some of the people who were wanted by Turkish courts, they were delivered at the border because they fled to SDF, and SDF handed them back. Could have been possible in the golden years between 2015 and 2018. But after Afrin, after the massacres and the issues that we have been seeing by pro-Turkey groups, and the approval of the Turkish army itself, and in stopping water of the Euphrates, and all the violations against women and civilians in Afrin, and not stopping them, and also in Serikani and Tel Abyad, I think that is the question. It should be coming from inside Turkey, the current government. Aside from that, with regards to the Iranian influence, one of the issues, one of the real reasons of why Altai attack happened and why the Syrian government did not support it was becoming a hotbed for the production and distribution of Captagon. The same Captagon shipments that are being sent from the ports of Syria through Lebanon and directly to Greece, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Italy, it was that issue, and it is happening. It's kind of trying to destabilize. The same thing is being happening by the Iranian government inside mainland Iran, and also it happens with the southern part of Iraq as well, extensively, with attempts in Kurdistan region. But the Department of Drugs is actually more in control in here and in Kurdistan region, compared to other parts of Syria that are controlled by the regime, or other parts of Iraq that are controlled by pro-Iranian militias. The drivers for this influence were attempts in the 80s with Al-Murtada association founded by Jamil al-Assad, which tried to link some of the Alawite community and also some other non-Alawite community to become more aligned with Shia in terms of the religious presence through economic interest. Heavily it happened in Deir ez-Zor, heavily it happened in Raqqa and in Hasakeh as well, with some people I know personally. They have been invited, some of them got scholarships in Iran since 1980s through now, but that presence diminished with the more sectarian narrative that governed the Syrian conflict for 10 years. Most of the pro-Iranian groups, which were mostly in the religious, non-military, mostly economic interests, did vanish from here. However, we do see one trend. Economic goods coming from both Turkey and Iran dominating the local market in all of Syria. By the time that Islam is talking, you can buy and purchase FS and other Turkish products here. The exchange economically that is actually happening in secret or since 2013 through Iraqi Kurdistan and sometimes, and after Manbij, it's direct the crossing policies that is generating income at lower costs for both transportation of goods into Northeast Syria and from Northeast Syria to Turkey and with other regions as well. That is what will eventually force Turkey, and this is what Iran is trying to fight. It's a trade route. It's not only an energy line. That has forced majority of Turkish products that went to the Gulf to go and use Haifa and Yafa and Tel Aviv ports, and then it goes to Jordan. It added cost to the Turkish products that are being marketed in the Gulf. And also you lost the Syrian market because of the purchase power of the local customer inside Syria. That has affected, but with many of the Syrian factories that were being sold into parts, stopped from production in Aleppo, these generated another vacuum to be filled by Turkish companies. We can also debate that because many of the Turkish businessmen reopened their businesses in Turkey as well. They're now part of the Turkish GDP as well. Still, the trade is happening. It expanded that the use of these networks economically that were used mostly, you are using Syrian ports, is now being using Turkish ports as well through this purchase that is happening through the Syrian community in Europe as well, with the trade is happening. That boom that is coming in a time that I think economy will solve what the guns and the politics didn't resolve.
Thank you, Qadar. Aviva, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd just like to add a little bit to what Dr. Özlem said as well, especially when it comes to looking at why the Turkish government was more or less okay with KRG becoming KRG, compared to why there doesn't really seem to be any avenue with the PYD and the autonomous administration in the same way. What I see as one of the main reasons, two main reasons for that, the first being oil pipelines. There are pipelines that run through KRG to Turkey. This creates a sense of economic interdependence for transportation, but also allows them to have a very specific negotiation point on a political sphere centering around independent economic independence and trade. And secondly, you have the government in Baghdad as well. And the government in Baghdad is strong enough to check the KRG, as we saw very severely following the vote on the referendum for Kurdish independence in Iraq. There was an immediate military backlash, the lockdown or the taking of contested areas. Kirkuk was completely occupied by the central Iraqi military. The airports were shut down. So Turkey doesn't have to fear in the same way the growth of Kurdish influence in Iraq because they have that extra check from the central government in Baghdad. Whereas In Syria, the Assad regime is no longer strong enough to make the same kind of immediate check should the autonomous administration attempt to grow in the same way, or attempt to declare independence, or attempt to invade Turkey. Not that I'm saying that's on the agenda, because it's not. But they don't have the same sort of back check, the same sort of power check, balance of powers, as they do in Iraq. So these reasons also have to be taken into consideration when you look at why the Turkish government would be okay with one versus not with the other. And with regard to your question about the role of the PKK and the transformation of leadership, you also have to look at the history of the PKK, the history of the ideology, and the history of the region itself. Because when you look at how the borders were drawn between Syria and Turkey, those borders, they cut through villages along the borders. These are the same families, the same communities that have lived there for centuries who, okay, now they have a border imposed on top of them, and some of them are suddenly Turkish and some of them are suddenly Syrian. But these are still families. These are still, there's still cross-border movement consistently. So when it comes to, yes, you have members on both sides, yes, because they're from the same families. And when you look at the creation of the ideology, of course, Abdullah Öcalan in the 70s began creating the ideology of democratic confederalism with influence from Murray Bookchin and other philosophers. And yes, when it began, they did use tactics that were very much deserving of the title of terrorist group. But the PKK did evolve as an organization, and they have since stopped using those tactics. When you see the ideology in practice, it's also very different in Turkey versus in Syria. Yes, democratic confederalism is the basis of ideology for both the PKK and the PYD. This is absolutely true. There is an ideological tie there. But you also have to look at why. And that is because the PKK was able to successfully build a system of civil society within Turkey that allowed Kurdish people to live their lives, preserve their languages, preserve their cultures. And so this was taken as a basis on democratic principles, democratic grassroots practices, as a solid basis for creating a similar system in Syria, which was also facing severe oppression of minorities, of languages, of indigenous cultures. So the ideology grew inside of Syria as well as a means of preserving their culture too. And when the war broke out, this is really when you see the transition, because this was an opportunity that has never presented itself in Turkey. There's never been the same sort of vacuum of power. And so when the PYD was able to put the system into practice, you saw immediate changes from how the PKK does this, because they are actually separate entities. They do have a lot of leadership components that they have learned from, as you said, cadres, leaders of the PKK. But this is also because it was much easier to become educated in Turkey. It was much easier to access resources, materials, readings, understand ideological differences, opinions. This was much, much easier to access in Turkey than it was in Syria. So a lot of the expertise needed to set up leadership and administration and systems and structures came from those that had access to resources and more experience and a better understanding of how to implement structures. That's not to say none of them were Syrian, many of them were. But they're not necessarily PKK cadres, they are PYD leaders. And the major break comes when you see democratic confederalism being implemented as an open administration in practice, because there have been so many changes and so many transitions as they really embrace flexibility and adaptability to make sure that the practical application of the ideology is matching the needs on the ground. And this is something that the PKK hasn't been able to do. And there has been a break in the way things are administered. And these are genuinely separate entities.
Okay, thank you very much. We have more questions from the audience. Actually, we didn't answer one question from the audience, the previous one, so I'm just going to repeat it with a bunch of other questions. So Yerne is asking, what will the post-war Syria bring for Syrian Kurds? What should we expect? Should we expect? Are you realistically, I guess, expecting that the administration will remain somewhat, or are they going to be somewhat co-opted by the Damascus regime, or what will happen? Eric is asking, and he's thanking you for great presentations. He's asking Özlem whether you see any difference between Turkish president and army leadership, in what extent and how to directly intervene in Rojava. His second question is both for Kadar and Aviva. To what extent is U.S. military presence in Rojava essential for keeping its control over territory? Then we have questions from Philip. Philip is asking, what does PYD or the administration offer to Arab tribes that are sort of acting independently or that are more loyal to the Syrian regime, but reside in the areas controlled by the SDF? And do they want to actively and work on dragging them to their side at all, or are they just accepting the modus vivendi is there, that some tribes are working with the regime and others not? And second, what are the immediate Turkish goals in northeast Syria for near future? And I think we will wrap here. Next batch of questions will come soon after. So we have a few questions. Whoever wishes to answer first, the floor is yours.
I will just add one thing. Aviva keeps repeating that there was less education in this region. Aviva, majority of Kurdish parties in Syria, they were mostly non-violent. Majority of the ideology for all these groups was center-left, and they outgrew the leftist communist approaches with the fall of the Soviet Union into a more center-left approach on both sides of the A, both the PYD and also non-PYD as well. That said, it was met with economic domination and cultural domination by Damascus. Through all of these years, there has been no military Kurdish presence, even in the aftermath of 2004. Majority of the community in these regions was preferring politics. So to Yerne, when you're talking about Syria after Ba'ath regime, not much people did believe when Hafez al-Assad died. Not much people still even believe that Bashar al-Assad will be removed. It could happen to natural reasons, of course, but most of the Kurdish elite in North Syria was thinking about decentralized governance, more cultural rights, self-administration, which is the current administration. This is the difference. Not much people talk about federalism. And even when you approach it, there are some narrative issues that people are discussing. And to a degree, I will add more. I will just extend my replies, Thomas. But when it comes to the US military presence, the US military presence is here for national security reasons by the US itself. This area is the only area where the community itself did defend. When somebody is saying pay their forces, you know, this is offending the local community, because people had light arms when the first attack of Nusra attacked Sarekaniye, and the community responded wasn't paid. Local communities with small rifles, they responded, and then it became organized to the other side of Syria, which was having so much influence and funneling of arms and money, and they failed to create a proper military leadership that can actually act only in the military issues and not intervene in the civilian issues. In this region, this differentiation happened. Even when you are discussing and addressing General Mazloum, there are issues that it's not his business. The civilian administration is different from SDF. And sometimes, especially in the immediate aftermath of liberating specific area, they have small mandate, but after that, no more, because most of the communities, what they want is services. Another question was by Philip. Kurdish struggle in Syria was not armed. It was forced to become armed in post-2012, not even 2011. So when you're telling me, does PYD offer Arab tribes? You know, these Arab tribes, if you go to their villages, you should come here and maybe see and discuss. All the area was underdeveloped for 70 years now, including Arab regions. The lack of access to resources for the Arabs in some places were even worse. This specific thing pushed the community to become more educated. If you compare the per capita of PhD holders in this region, and including the aftermath of 2015, you will find massive numbers that can run 10 countries and 10 governments, not only Northeast Syria. But they are scattered in Europe, in Turkey, in Iraq, and other places as well. And again, I will revert to the first discussion, which was economic domination. These Arab tribes were economically dominated by Damascus, but today they have more liberties. People are now being introduced to more space in terms of economy, and they are enjoying these livelihoods. They will be the first to refuse Damascus influence, by the way. But that is happening in Latakia as well. This is happening even in areas controlled by the government and the opposition as well. This is why I don't believe if you have enjoyed this kind of the differentiation that Aviva was mentioning between PKK ideology and practice here, you know, we have the tax income of the individual is 1 per 1,000. This is more capitalist than the United States. And the type of economy, how it will be evolving is different. And the community are much more into having civilian life, push for better life circumstances. And I think this could become a role model. And again, Turkish companies mostly produce civilian use products. This could be a market. And I don't believe that the current war in Syria will continue, but Syrians are very active in terms of work. And this is why revitalizing the economy will provide many opportunities to the surrounding countries. Syria did miss it when Iraq was being reconstructed because of a political mentality in Damascus. I don't believe that that mentality, it only led to what happened in Syria itself in 2011. And that's not a good lesson that Turkey could learn from.
Thank you, Kadar. I think now we will give floor to Özlem, because you said your schedule is kind of tight and we are already a little bit over time. So the floor is yours to answer your questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for your understanding. Okay, so I saw a few questions that are directed to me, so I'll try to be as quick as possible. So I see the question about whether there is any difference between the Turkish president, or let's say, you know, the government as a whole, and the army leadership. That was the case in the past, but not really in the current situation, especially from the mid-2000s onwards. It's not that, you know, possible to talk about that distinction. You know, in the past, there was the government, and then the military was a pretty politically powerful figure in Turkey. But after the, I mean, first it was the EU harmonization reforms in the early 2000s, and then there was these alleged coup trials, and after that, the nature of the military really changed, and that's why it's not really, you know, possible to talk about a distinction. I think there was also a question about the Turkish goals for the near future. I mean, I can give a pretty quick answer to that. Well, Turkey wants to prevent the emergence of an official status, you know, for the autonomous region there. Basically, you know, for the future of Syria, Turkey does not want to see an official, you know, political status. And I think says this, you know, openly. Also, okay, so the last question, whether the Turkish government is using, you know, this relationship is an excuse or not. Well, I can't really know that, but I think I can say that, I mean, I say this because, I study decision-making mechanisms, right? So that there are some things that I derive, from the discourse, from the things that are said by the, political figures, but there are things that I can never know. Even if I ask these people, I cannot know. But what I can say is that, yes, this is a choice, right? I mean, the Turkish government, after some point, made the decision or made the choice to securitize the PYD or YPG and both. So they made the decision to securitize this actor, making or emphasizing the connections between this actor and the PKK. So that's definitely a choice, right? It's a policy, and this actually was also bought by the audience in Turkey too. So that's why, since you can actually, support this claim, with certain things, this is also bought by the Turkish audience, the Turkish public, right? That's why it's really difficult to overcome. I don't say that it's impossible, but it's really difficult to overcome. And, I agree that some of the actors that Turkey is allied with, some of the things that are done by these actors are creating a negative image for Turkey. I mean, yes, I mean, I also read the newspapers and, read some of the things, I agree. And that's also a choice, made by the Turkish government. I think they are, of course, aware of these consequences, but, in their cost benefit calculation, that's what, that's the actor that, or these are the actors that they wanted to work together because, as I said, I mean, they perceive, or the current government, perceives this area as a major threat to Turkish national security, and they really want to prevent the emergence of an official status, for this region, and that's why, that's the choice that they made. Yeah, I think this is as objective of an answer as I can give.
Thank you, Özlem. I think there are no more questions directly directed at you. So if you have to leave, please feel free, and thank you very much. But Aviva, Kadar, if you still have time, you can delve into the questions we left out, especially Aviva hasn't answered the
Let me then just interrupt a little bit and say thank you all, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for this great discussion. I mean, these were all very informative talks, and nice meeting you all. So I'm very sorry, but I will have to leave. Of course,
it's my fault as a moderator. I screwed up. I was supposed to finish at 6:30. Thank you very much. Thank you for your participation. So Aviva, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so with regard to the question about to what extent is U.S. military presence in Rojava essential for keeping its control over territory, I don't think that a large U.S. military presence is essential. I think the SDF has proven itself as strong enough of a militia force that, if the regime were to attempt to retake this territory, it would cost them more than it would gain. And I think they realize that, the consequences of attempting to retake all of Northeast Syria, it would cost them severely. And I think they realize that, and you can see the proof of that realization in the way that the administration and the regime handled the sharing of a major city in the Northeast. You can see the lines of which side is which and who administers where. And they realize that this is a stalemate for a reason, that this is an effective militia force. They have proven themselves time and time again to be the most effective militia force on the ground in this area. I would say the US military presence is more essential for making sure that Turkey doesn't start bombing intermittently. And you really, and this goes back to looking at Turkey and their approach to eradicating this threat of the PKK, so they say. And the way in which they've gone about this, because in my opinion, they have done more to destabilize the region and increase the threat to their national security by doing things like creating a water crisis, destroying infrastructure, destroying access to safe havens. You have instances of Turkish border guards shooting at refugees trying to cross. These are not SDF soldiers, these are women and children, fleeing violence. You have instances of the Turkish military actively breaching the national sovereignty of the Syrian state by invading and occupying Afrin, by destroying olive groves and farms along the borders, especially in Serkaniye. So if, in my opinion, the actions that the Turkish government are taking belie their almost, I don't want to say obsession, but I can't think of another word right now, but with destroying this threat that they've created themselves, because the autonomous administration has never made any indication that they want to take territory from the Turkish side of the border. There's never been any indication of that. There's never been any claim to that. The only expression that the autonomous administration has made is that they would like to be allowed to make their own decisions in the region that they already control. So yeah, as far as extended US military presence, I think actively holding Turkey accountable for its actions is what the US military should be doing, and preventing them from creating a more destabilized region by actively going after the region in northern Syria. As for Syria after the Ba'ath regime, I have a crystal ball. I think Qatar already said everything that I would have said as well on that. As well on the other questions. I think, Yusuf, your question as well about using the PKK as an excuse. Yes, I think this definitely can be said. And I think also as Özlem said, the cost efficiency or risk analysis that the Turkish regime has taken in allying with these particular forces, when you see things like Turkey's gone into Syrian territory, kidnapped members of the SDF who have never committed any crime on Turkish territory, let alone any crime on Syrian territory, have brought them back to Turkey, have tried them on Turkish soil, and have imprisoned them in Turkish prisons. These are not generally considered best practices under international humanitarian law. So yes, I would say that they are using these ties with the PKK as an example to commit extrajudicial violations of human rights and violations of international law.
Okay, I think that's all of the questions.
I'll add one thing here.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, mostly when you're talking about future, none of us had this even ideas. We were some of the early groups that were saying stabilization will definitely start with terror. And in this view, many Syrian elite was conflicted. People were disillusioned with the opposition that was harboring elements of terrorism, and they even refused to fight it. And Turkey was encouraging them to refuse to fight ISIS. And that led that there was a door open for SDF and YPG to play a role. And all of that propaganda in many countries that was supporting only the opposition, no matter what they do, was a problem, especially for civilian community all over Syria and civil society that was denouncing violence. That created a space that was the best model in Syria. Unfortunately, the threat came from outside. Unfortunately, the levels of violence that came as a result of the Turkish intervention were no less than the one inflicted by Assad regime. And then we see it all over the place. It has become a harboring area for not only Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but it's also being used as mercenaries in Libya, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and other places as well. And possibly tomorrow that we see Syrian groups, pro-Turkey groups, go to Afghanistan. That is a real possibility. We do not know, but I will correlate some issues that happened and was happening at the same time when Turkey was attacking northeast Syria.
Qatar, only if you can be really quick, because we are already past our time.
The attack on Afrin happened when there was a discussion to relieve Turkey from the sanctions against Iran. And then suddenly you see in Turkey that there is an excavation of gold. It's only just an outdoor of what happened with the Khalq Bank issue in the United States of money laundering, Iranian money laundering through Turkish companies and Turkish banks, and the US financial systems just rejecting it. I think that was the kind of one of the factors for the Turkish intervention in northeast Syria. The security thing is a hype. It's like saying Taiwan gonna invade China. Doesn't make sense. 3 million will not stand the chance at the face of 90 million, but it's only an issue of weaponizing refugees, weaponizing IDPs created by the attack, and then being funneled to Europe as a bargaining chip for more funds, for more consent to their bullying of European countries. But I don't think it's going to last, because there are other contenders as well trying to replace that and become kind of heaven for the region. The only region that can actually have refugees returned to is northeast Syria, nowhere else in Syria. So you need to have services and stabilization, but it's not going to happen if you are cutting the water. And this is creating and using climate change and weaponizing against the human population. So I don't think it's going to be lasting, or anybody will be abiding by it.
Okay, thank you very much, Qatar Aviva. I would also like to thank to the audience. I think this was very interesting, very fruitful. And I hope I will see you sometime next time physically in Prague with us. Not to say that this was bad, but of course it's much better to see each other in person, face to face. So once again, thank you very much, and have a nice evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks to you and Severo. And thanks, Aviva.
Thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.